to our course on Microsoft Project 2019. My name is Deborah and I'm your instructor on this course. I'm a MOS certified TAP accredited IT trainer, and I've been working in the IT training arena for about 11 years now, and I have a background in the IT industry, and I've been working in the IT industry for about 24 years, so quite a lot of time. I've worked in both the public and the private sector, and I've conducted predominantly Microsoft training across roughly 25 different countries. And I've taught Microsoft Project in classrooms many times, and my own experience extends to work in both the private and the public sectors in the UK and also in Australia. So hopefully that gives me a really good foundation in which to be presenting this course for you today. And I'm going to assume on this course that you have pretty much no knowledge of Microsoft Project. This really is a course that's aimed primarily at people who are new to using Microsoft Project. So if you have used it before, you may find that some of the early sections involve material that you're fairly familiar with. But particularly for the first 2 or 3 sections, I do suggest that you go through them, because in those I'll cover some of the main aspects of Project 2019 that may be different from the version of Project that you're used to. And I'll also cover things like what's new in Project 2019. If you are completely new to Microsoft Project, and I appreciate that many of you will be, I will be assuming that you're familiar with Windows software. So you know how to do some basic things like copy and paste. And to some extent, I'll assume that you may have used the Microsoft ribbons before, although I will explain it just in case you haven't. And in particular, I will assume that you have a good basic knowledge of project management itself. So you'll know what I mean when I talk about things like schedule, resources, and over allocation. If you don't understand some of those basic concepts in project management, you probably need to cover a bit of basic material on project management in general first before you go through this course, because this course does very much rely on a reasonable knowledge of what's involved in managing a project. Now, one thing I'm not going to do is assume that we're managing projects in a particular field. My field's always tended to be IT one way or another, but in fact the main sample projects that I'm going to use on this course don't really have anything to do with IT at all. We're going to refit a bathroom, or rather you are, and I'm going to organise a wedding. Now, neither of those have anything in particular to do with IT. Now, what you can see here is the Project Professional 2019 start screen, and we're talking about the desktop software here. We're not going to be covering things like Project Online in this course. So in the next few sections, we're going to talk about the structure of the course, and in particular, I'm going to start to talk about the projects that we're going to work through as we're working through the course. So essentially, if you already have Project installed on your PC, you can skip the next section and go straight to the one after that, where I'm going to talk about the structure. For those of you who don't have Project already installed on your PC, you'll need to go through the next section with me, and I'll explain what your options are. So that's it for this section. I will see you in the next one. Hello again, and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section, I want to talk about the versions of Microsoft Project that are available. And for those of you who don't yet have Microsoft Project installed, I recommend the version or versions that are most appropriate for use on this course. So I'll talk briefly about acquiring and installing Project 2019. Now, one thing you'll hear me say quite a bit on the course about Microsoft products is that I'm looking at a page on Microsoft.com here that's probably going to be different by the time you come to look at it. They tend to change these pages on a really regular basis, which in itself is fine, but it means that I need you to basically search for the equivalent of this page if you want to get the latest information. Now, what's important about this page is that it gives us a nice big link to jump to all the different Microsoft Project products that are available through the Microsoft website. So let's click on See Products and Pricing. And what you'll see first are two tabs at the top here, cloud-based solutions and on-premise solutions. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's the difference between the two? Well, the cloud-based solutions, which we see here, which, if I'm honest, is Microsoft's preferred solution, this relates to Office 365, which is probably a term that you've heard of floating around, even if you haven't used it. And there are three options here for Office 365, Project Online Essentials, Project Online Professional, and Project Online Premium. And each one of those has various advantages and disadvantages to buying it. Now, the cloud-based solutions are subscriptions. That means you pay a monthly subscription in order to essentially rent that software from Microsoft. But what it also means is that if you do buy an Office 365 subscription, it means that your version of Project will always be kept up to date automatically, which is a really, really good feature. It means that you don't have to buy the next version of Project in order to keep up with the latest updates. So the subscription option is a really good option. Now, this course is Project 2019, and that comes under this second option, on-premise solutions. On-premise basically means a one-time standalone purchase. So you can see here the prices are a lot higher. And we have two options that we could buy if we wanted to, Project Standard and Project Professional. And you can see the difference between the two of them there. So Project Standard is on-premises project management for those who don't need collaboration tools and other advanced features. And Project Professional, as you would expect, is a comprehensive on-premises project management solution. So which one you choose is entirely up to you. Now, Project 2019 is only available as an on-premise solution. Essentially, this latest version, 2019, is really for people who haven't subscribed to Office 365. So it basically brings Project 2019 in line with all the updates that are constantly happening in the Office 365 versions of Project. So essentially, if you've had in the past Project 2016 through Office 365, it's going to be very, very similar to the on-premise version of Project 2019. So there will be a lot of crossover. A lot of the things available in 2016 are available in Project 2019. There's really not too much of a difference between the two. But as we said, our focus on this course is in Project 2019. So in terms of acquiring the actual software, if you don't have it on your PC, you can see there you have a Buy Now link. And I'm on the US version of the website, which is why it's in dollars. So if I was going to purchase Project Standard, I could click on Buy Now, and that will take me through to my cart where I can purchase Project Standard 2019. And that will come to you as a digital download. So you can literally click on the link and it will start off the project installer. So very, very simple to install. Now, I can't give you exact installation instructions because that will depend on a lot of the settings that you have on your PC. But I'm sure we've all downloaded and installed things in the past. It's always a very straightforward process. So I don't envisage you having too many problems with the actual installation of the software. So there we go. Install the software and then you'll be ready to start off the course. I'm ready to start. I hope you are as well. Please join me in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section, I'm going to take a very quick look at what's new in Project 2019. And one of the reasons that it is a quick look is that there isn't really very much of a difference between Project 2019 and Project 2016 in terms of functionality that's specific to Project. So I'm currently looking at one of the pages on office.com and it's called What's New in Project 2019. Now, as I pointed out before, I normally say at this point that you need to check the latest information. Well, I don't expect they're going to put anything else new in Project 2019, so when you come to watch this video, I don't expect any other additions. But let's go through some of the main points anyway, because there are just a few of them. So the first thing it says here, the opening paragraph, is if you're upgrading to Project Professional 2019 from 2016, you'll still have all of the features that you're used to, and you'll notice a few new ones as well. And this is a really interesting one actually, linking tasks using a drop-down menu. So instead of having to remember the ID of a task when you're linking tasks together, what you can do is just click in the predecessors column, and from the drop-down arrow you'll get a list of all of the different tasks, so you can create links between them very easily. So that's a really nice new feature in 2019. You'll also see the addition of a task summary name field. And as it says in here, with a long list of tasks, it can be difficult to know what a task is indented under in the overall project plan. So the task summary name field is a read-only field, and it shows the name of the task's summary task. So again, that's going to be really helpful. Now I realise at this stage in the course this is probably going to mean nothing to you, but as I said, there are only 3 or 4 new features in here, so I thought I might as well highlight them to you. Another new feature is the timeline bar labels and task progress. So this is a really good one as well. So our timeline bars, which we're going to build up as we go through, can now be labeled. So it makes them a little bit more meaningful, because you can have the name of the task and also the task progress shown right on the tasks themselves. So it makes it very quick to illustrate your plan and the work in progress when sharing status. And of course, there's always improvements made to accessibility with each new release of Microsoft Office. So in 2019, it's now a lot easier for Windows Narrator and other assistive technology to read more elements of Project, which is always an excellent feature to have for anybody who has impairments in that area. And then you'll see at the bottom of that page, we have some basic tutorials for adding tasks in Project, and also a Project Quick Start Guide. So as you can see, not too many changes in there, but the ones that they have made are very useful and very important. The other thing that I think is always really helpful when you're going into a new version of a piece of software is to have a look on the Microsoft site at some of the blogs related to Project. And there's so many of them down here, but those can also be really helpful and provide you with extra information when it comes to putting together your projects. So I would definitely check out the blog site within Microsoft.com. And that's it really, short and sweet with regards to changes. That's what's new in Project 2019. In the next section, we're actually going to get started on a project, so please join me for that. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section, I'm going to take you on a tour of the project workspace, and we're also going to start creating a very simple project. And I'll use that very simple project to demonstrate key points concerning the project workspace. Now, you've already seen this start screen, and you'll probably see this quite a few times during the course. Although, as you'll see a little bit later on, you may want to disable the start screen once you really get used to using Project 2019. You might decide that you can get along perfectly well without it. Now, let me give you a quick tour of the start screen itself. Over on the left, we have an area which gives us links to existing projects. We have a recent section just there at the top, and currently for me, this section is empty. Once we start working on projects, you'll start to see a list of recent projects appear just there. And then below that, there is a link to open other projects, which gives us access to a Windows Browse dialog, so you can browse your computer, you can browse any network locations you have access to, and you can browse cloud areas such as your OneDrive storage. Now we're going to start with a new project, so we won't be using that part of the start screen on this occasion. In the top right, we have some standard Windows buttons. The little question mark is Help. Note the screen tip there. For Help, F1 is the keyboard shortcut. Then we have the Minimize and we have the Maximize or Restore, depending on whether your screen is currently maximized or not. And then we also have a Close button. Below that, we have my name and the account under which I'm currently running Project 2019. If you're the only person that uses this PC, and if you're the only person that uses Project on this PC, and you only have one account that you ever run Project under, then this will always indicate that account. But if, for example, you sometimes use a work account and sometimes a personal account, if you share this PC with somebody else, you may want to switch between accounts. And you have a facility just here to switch accounts. I'll demonstrate that for you a little bit more fully later on. Now let me talk about the rest of the start screen, and I'm going to say this once more. You may not see exactly the same as me. It will depend on a number of things, but almost certainly the first thing you will see here is a blank project thumbnail. I'm going to click on that in a little while and we're going to create a new blank project. So essentially, blank project is the starting point for a new project. Let's run through some of these others first of all though. If you run projects that have an element of similarity, maybe you do building projects, marketing projects, then you may already have a project that you'd like to base a new one on. And the second thumbnail here, new from existing project, enables you to use an existing project as a starting point for a new one. The third thumbnail, new from an Excel workbook, lets you create a project from an Excel workbook. And what this basically means is that you have perhaps a list of tasks on a worksheet in an Excel workbook, and you want to make a list of tasks the starting point for a project. The fourth thumbnail, new from SharePoint task list, is a pretty similar kind of thing, but in relation to SharePoint. So if you have a list of tasks in Microsoft SharePoint and you want to use those as the basis for a project, you can use that option. Now the other thumbnails all correspond to different standard project templates. So if I were working on a software development project, I could use the first template there, Software Development Plan, and it would get me started on a typical set of tasks as a starting point for a software development project. Now you'll see a whole list of these templates. These templates you may think of in the old terminology as boilerplates, but nowadays we generally call them templates. And there are lots and lots of them there. So residential construction is there, for example, new business plan is another one, but there are available online many templates that you can base new projects on. And there is a search facility at the top here. So if you wanted a project plan for a particular thing, you could do a search here. In fact, there are some standard searches, suggested searches as they call them, underneath. So we have projects, schedules, themes, analysis, so on and so forth. Let's suppose, and this is definitely potentially going to be very useful, I wanted to look for a project plan for a wedding. So let me do a search on a wedding. This, of course, is an online facility, so I need to be connected to the internet. And let's click the magnifying glass. And it comes up with a wedding planner. If I were to click on that wedding planner, then I would see a little bit more detail about what this wedding planner is. So it shows me the first few tasks, it gives me a description, it says wedding planner provided by Microsoft Corporation, it tells me how big it is, and it gives me a little bit of a description about the wedding planner. And then I could use that to create a wedding plan. And in fact, it's not very far removed from what I'm going to be doing a little bit later on. But let me just close that for the moment and go back to this screen, because apart from giving me potential project templates for a wedding, there are search results from other Office applications. Let's look at PowerPoint, for instance. There are 3 items found in relation to PowerPoint. Now, each of these is a template for a PowerPoint presentation. So there's a picture frame wedding photo album, a wedding seating arrangement plan, and also a simple wedding photo album. Now, there are other suitable wedding-related artifacts that can be used in Word, Publisher, and Excel. So we're not really going to cover that on this course, but they can be very useful links to other artifacts that you can use with the other components of Office. Having taken a look at that, let's go back to the start screen and we just use the back button up here. And we're going to create a blank project. Now, as soon as I do this, I want you to look at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen because a little message will pop up just for a few seconds that you'll get used to seeing, and after a while you'll probably just ignore it, but I need to explain it to you briefly now and then in a little bit more detail later on. So click on blank project and then look down immediately in the bottom left-hand corner. And you'll see a message that says new tasks are created in manually scheduled mode. As you'll see later on, there are two modes of scheduling. There's manually scheduled and there's auto scheduled. Most of the time, I tend to work in auto scheduled mode, and after you've been using Project for a while, you will choose the mode which you prefer. The fact that I currently have this in manually scheduled mode and you may or may not have it in manually scheduled mode really doesn't matter at the moment. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. What we need to concentrate on here is the workspace overall. So first of all, in the top left-hand corner, you have the quick access toolbar that I mentioned earlier on in the course. You may not see quite the same buttons as me there, but we'll come back to that in a couple of sections' time. And in the top right-hand corner, you have some standard Windows buttons. Let me just hover over those. So you have minimize, restore down, and also a close button. The main ribbon is this, so it's the big block right across the screen, very near the top. I'm going to explain the ribbon to you in quite a bit of detail again in a couple of sections from now. Above the ribbon in the middle is the name of the current project. We've just created a project, so by default it's called Project 1. If we created another one, by default it would be called Project 2 and so on. Now below the ribbon we have something called the entry bar. And the entry bar is something that we can use to enter and edit data into our project. You may or may not have the entry bar shown. If you don't see that, then don't worry. I'm going to show you in a while how to show that if it isn't already shown. Basically, the kind of thing we use the entry bar for is this. If I want to enter the name of the first task in my project, I can click in the task name field there. And then if I click in the entry bar, I could call it task 1. Having typed that, I can click on the tick mark to the left of the task, and that will become my first task. If I click down to the next row, and maybe I intend to type task 2, I could type task 2, change my mind and click on the cross to the left of the task entry bar. And that will cancel whatever I'm typing. So that's the entry bar, more on that later. Below the entry bar we have the timeline. I mentioned the timeline much earlier on when I was talking about what's new and the fact that you can have several timelines now in Project 2019. You may or may not see the timeline. If you don't see it, you can show it by going up to the ribbon and clicking on View. And roughly in the middle, or just to the right of the middle, you see a command there or a checkbox that says Timeline. If I uncheck Timeline, you can see the timeline disappears, check it again, and it comes back again. So that's the timeline. When I've got some tasks, it will show those tasks on the timeline. Now, in fact, I've just entered one task there. It hasn't got any work in it, and the timeline can be set to run over a period of time. Now, by default, my new project is starting today, so that's March the 4th. And because I haven't got any tasks or work scheduled at the moment, you'll see on the right-hand end of the timeline, it also says March the 4th. So currently, it's not the most exciting project in the world. Below the timeline is the main project window. And by default, on my installation, I show a Gantt chart. And a Gantt chart actually comprises two parts. It comprises the list of tasks. It's actually a table, and we refer to this as the table. And on the right, we have the chart itself, which is normally a pictorial representation of the tasks in my project. Now, you may or may not have a Gantt chart shown. If you don't have a Gantt chart shown, you will find out soon how to show a Gantt chart there. And there will be situations when you'll want to see one of the many other types of chart that you can show in the main body of the display there in the main window. Now, just to give you a little bit more of an idea of how that's going to look, let's go back to that first task, task 1. I'm going to click in the duration column, and I'm going to say that this is a 2-day task. Click elsewhere, and there is my Gantt bar for a 2-day task. Now, there are various things about that bar in terms of its color, its ends, and so on that each have significance, and we're going to talk more about those later on. But basically, as we start to build up a schedule, we build up entries in the table on the left, and each of those will be represented by a Gantt bar or other appropriate symbol in the chart on the right. The next aspect of the workspace to look at is the status bar across the bottom of the project window. At the left-hand end, there are optional pieces of information. One of the ones that's shown there is new tasks are manually scheduled, which I mentioned earlier on in this section. And at the right-hand end, there are controls for the view. So we can do things like choose the view of the project we currently have, and we can also use the zoom controls. And again, more on those later. And the last part of the workspace that I want to look at is what's called the backstage or backstage view. Now, what we're looking at here is effectively a project. It's a very simple project with one task in it at the moment, but this is where we work on the contents of our project. The administration of projects, so doing everything from saving them to printing them to maybe sharing them, that's all done in what's called the backstage view or just backstage. And if I go into backstage view, and you can do that by clicking on File, you'll see that backstage view has a load of options. So we have info, new, open, save, save as, print, share, export, close, account feedback, and options. And we'll be dipping in and out of here as we go through the course. It's also, for example, in the backstage view where we can set up project information. When I've been using backstage view, I get back to my project again by using that back button in the top left-hand corner. And that takes me back to my project. So there we are. That's all the basics of the workspace for now. In the next section, I want to take a quick look at help, so please join me for that. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section, we're going to take a look at project options. And to a large extent, project options represent your own personalization of your installation of project and in the way that you use project on your projects. Some of these options you need to have set correctly before you start to create and work on any kind of substantial project. And in fact, as we're going to get started on our exercise project in the next section, it's very important that you go through this one carefully. Even if you've used Microsoft Project before, I suggest that you follow this section through because I'm going to make sure that we cover all of the essential options so that when you start working on the exercise, you won't finish up having to sort of go back and redo things later on. So to access project options the normal way is to go into the backstage view. So we'll click File, and right at the bottom we have Options. And that brings up the Project Options dialog. Now, you've seen this already because there are various points where you get taken to this dialog, often to a specific page on this dialog, and you're given the opportunity there to change something or set something. So you may well recall that when we were looking at the Quick Access Toolbar, for example, we went to this Quick Access Toolbar page and used the controls on this page to add a button to the Quick Access Toolbar, that bold button. In fact, I think I'm going to, while I'm here, remove that bold button now. So I'll select it and click on the Remove button in the middle. And I'm also going to remove the Quick Print button as well. Now, what we're going to do in this section is go systematically through these pages and look at the options that we need to get set straight away. Now, in order to demonstrate the way that many of the options work, I'm going to do a quick demo in relation to what's called screen tip style. The very top entry on the first page, the general page, underneath user interface options, we have screen tip style. And it currently says show feature descriptions in screen tips. If I click the drop down here, there are three options. Show feature description in screen tips, don't show feature descriptions in screen tips, and don't show screen tips. Now at the moment, with the first option selected, if I just click on OK, if I hover over one of the buttons on the ribbon, so let's say if I hover over Move, you'll see that I get that screen tip there for Move Task. And you can see that it's telling me that it moves the selected tasks forward or back in the project schedule. Now let me go back into Options and let me change that to Don't Show Feature Descriptions in Screen Tips. Click on OK and let me hover over Move again. And now all I get is Move Task. So that's the name of the command, but not a description of what it does. Let's go back into Options once more. And obviously if I choose the third option here, Don't Show Screen Tips, and click on OK, and once again hover over Move, you'll see that I don't get anything. Now I personally like to have the description there, so I'm going to put that back to what it was originally from Options, and we'll just set that back to Show Feature Descriptions in Screen Tips. Now let's look at some of the other key ones on this general page. The default view for me is Gantt with timeline. I pointed that out to you a couple of times. That's the default view when I open up project, in particular when I start working on a new project, that's what I see. And I can also choose here my default date format, which is the short form of the day of the week, and then the month, day, and year. And if you prefer, there are various other date formats that you can choose from that drop-down list. My username is also here with my initials. Now you may think, well, what difference does that make? Well, if you're collaborating with other people on projects and if you're sharing projects and so on, you may do many things. For example, comment on projects. You may make certain other changes to projects which are identified as being by you. And having your username and initials set correctly here enables other people to track that it was you that made that change or made that comment. Now, if you remember right back to near the beginning of the course, I talked about the fact that one of the new features in Project 2019 was the availability of some alternative Office themes. And down here is where you can choose them. So if we click the drop down in Office theme, you can see we have colourful, dark grey, black and white. Now I've currently got colourful selected, which is my personal preference, but if I selected, for example, say dark grey and clicked on OK, you can immediately see the effect there. And I think if I was to select this one, it might make it a bit harder for you to see these videos. So I'm just going to go back and I'm going to change that back to colourful. And something else that I mentioned earlier on in the course is that you can suppress the showing of the start screen just with that checkbox at the bottom. If I uncheck that, click on OK to save the change, next time I start project, I won't see the start screen. Again, that's something for you to try out to see if you're happier with that arrangement. Just incidentally, while we're talking about these changes that we're making, it's worth pointing out that most changes you make in project options are activated when you click OK to close that project options dialog. There are a small number of changes where you do need to restart project for them to take effect, but when it is necessary to restart project, it does actually tell you that you need to restart project for the change to take effect. The next page I want to look at is the display page. And there are two important options here that I want to highlight. First of all, for each project that you work on, you can set the currency options. At the moment, we only have project 1 here, and the drop-down lets me choose from any available projects. So there's only project 1 currently. and I can set a symbol, the decimal digits, the currency, and so on. And the second option on this page, again, going back to something that I mentioned earlier on, if I don't see the entry bar, it's probably because this option down here for entry bar is unchecked. So make sure that's checked and you'll see the entry bar between the ribbon and the timeline. Now the next page is the schedule page. And there are a couple of very important settings here, which I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to set based on trusting what I'm telling you at the moment. I'm going to explain these settings to you a little bit later on in the course, but at the outset, I'd like you to have them set in a particular way. Now, there are some very straightforward settings on this page. So for instance, the week starts on a Sunday and the fiscal year starts in January. Now, you may be tempted to do things like change the default start time and end time for working days, where you work, hours per day, hours per week, etc. By all means, set those if you want to. I will be talking about those and calendars in general in a bit of detail later on. At this stage, it's not really that important that you get them quite right at the moment. Two settings I do want you to set in a particular way, though, are these. First of all, new task created manually scheduled. Now, I've mentioned that before. I've currently got new task created manually scheduled. I want you to set that to the other option, auto scheduled. And it's very likely that for most of you, this will be the way to leave this setting set in the longer term. And what this basically means is that when you create a task in a project, it becomes auto schedule, which means that as you schedule the project, or in many cases as Project 2019 schedules the project, this one is automatically scheduled according to all of the constraints, dependencies, resource availability, and all the other factors that come in to force this task to be scheduled accordingly. If you leave this set at manually scheduled for new tasks, then each task that's created is manually scheduled, and each task that you create either has to be individually changed to auto schedule, or you have to manually schedule each task. There may be situations in which manually scheduled tasks is what you want, and I'll talk about that later on. But for the moment, I want you to make sure that's set at auto scheduled. The other setting that I want you to make sure is set in a particular way is down here where it says calculation. So we have calculate project after each edit, on or off. Now I'd like you to make sure that this is set to on, which means that each time we make a change to the schedule, Project 2019 will automatically calculate the effects of that change without you having to take a separate calculation stop. Now, I'll explain more of the significance of that setting later on in the course as well. But basically, for the moment, just bear in mind that Project 2019 has to do a lot, particularly in a large project, to work out how to schedule things. And each time you make a change, you really need to see the effects that change has had potentially on whole parts of the project. And if you don't have that set to on, you have to separately and as a manual exercise tell Project 2019 to calculate the project, or i.e. to reschedule it. So for the moment, I'd like you to set that to on as well. And as I say, with both of those settings, we'll look at those in more detail later. The next page is the proofing page, and that relates to spell check-in and auto-correction as you're typing. I'm not going to go through that at this stage, but if you've used the proofing facilities in other components of Microsoft Office, such as Microsoft Word, I'm sure you'll be able to go through there and make the appropriate settings correct for you. Now we come to the Save page, and there are a couple of very important settings here. One of them is the default file location. And this is the location where any project files that you save will be saved by default. It's set when you install Project 2019 to one of the folders within your personal Windows directory. You may want to leave it set there, or you may want to save your project files by default somewhere else. That is entirely your decision. So mine is currently set to save in the default location. The next option is the auto save option. And again, if you've used other components of Microsoft Office, you might be tempted to switch autosave on. And that will cause Project 2019 to save your work at regular intervals according to the number of minutes selected in this box just here. Now, you may well be tempted to switch that on, but I don't, and there is a good reason for that. Unlike other components of Microsoft Office, if you have autosaved switched on, each time autosave occurs, it clears your undo history. So once an autosave happens, you cannot then undo. Now, for some people, they're quite happy to work on that principle. Perhaps they don't use undo very much, or perhaps they're very careful. You can in fact use this option for a prompt to warn you when an autosave is about to happen. But in my case, I prefer to leave autosave switched off. But again, ultimately, this is your choice. The next page also has some very important settings. And this page determines the language that you're using to work in Microsoft Project. Now, you can have more than one language installed, and you can select different ones for different situations. So you can see here I have English United States and English United Kingdom as the two languages that I use. They are sufficiently different to warrant being described as two different languages, and my default is set to English United States. If you need to add an additional language, it is very straightforward. There is a drop down just here, which gives you access to many more languages. And in particular, with a particular project, most people find that their default language is the one they use most of the time. But if you do work in more than one language, even if the two languages are two versions of English, you do need to be aware of this language setting. And when you're working on a project, make sure that you have the appropriate language selected. Now let me quickly run through the remaining pages of project options. There are no settings on the advanced page that you need to worry about now. We will be looking at one or two settings from here later on. Customize ribbon is the equivalent of the customization page for the quick access toolbar, and it does look quite similar. The main difference is that rather than say selecting commands from the list on the left and then adding them to what was the quick access toolbar on the right, what you would normally do is create your own tab and then copy commands from the left-hand list to your groups on your new tab. And then what you could do is build up your own custom tabs on the ribbon. Now, I'm not going to cover that now, but by all means, have a look at the help, give it a try, and see how you get along with it. Don't forget, you can always click the reset button at the bottom there to put things back to how they were if everything goes horribly wrong. The Quick Access Toolbar page you've already seen, and you've also seen me use it. Add-ins are out of scope for this course. And the Trust Centre is also out of scope for this course. There is one thing I would like to say about the Trust Centre though. In Project 2019, mainly the Trust Centre is concerned with the fact that one way that people can get malicious content onto your computer is to get you to run macros, and macros can be included within a Microsoft project file. So one thing you want to do is make sure that you have the macros setting disabled for all macros with notification. So if we go into Trust Center settings and we just want to check that we have our settings set to disable all macros with notification. And then if you open a project file from somebody else and it says, I want to run a macro, if you know who the person is that you've got the project file from and you absolutely trust the source, you can let the macro run. But if not, you can say, nope, I'm not going to let that macro run. So that's it. That's the basics, the overview of project options. And we're going to be looking at quite a few others as we go along. Please make sure that you've got set the ones that I said you should have set. That's it for this section. I will see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section, I'm going to start work on the project plan for a wedding. Now, of course, different people would have very different opinions on what might be part of the arrangements for a wedding. So what I'm going to try and do is come up with a project plan for a wedding that has enough detail in it to be reasonably realistic, but which will also reflect the different styles of wedding that you may get in different parts of the world, in different cultures and so on. Having said that, the style of wedding that I'm planning here is not one that's associated with any particular religion. Now, what you're going to be doing very soon is planning the refit of a bathroom in a domestic house. So what I'm going to try and show you while I'm doing this wedding plan is some of the ideas that I want you to incorporate into building up the plan for the bathroom refit. You may well find when you're looking at either of these projects that they don't really reflect how you would set about doing them, but really that's not the point. You're learning the tools in Microsoft Project to do these things. You're not actually learning how to either plan a wedding or refit a bathroom. Another important point to make here is that we're building these things up in layers. I'm not going to go deep into the details straight away. We will certainly get into the detail, but what we will do is one layer at a time, and I'll explain the tools and techniques associated with Project 2019 as we go. So first of all, I've made a list of the main aspects of this wedding plan, so let's take a look at that first. Now, I'm sure this isn't going to be quite right, but I've made this list. It's actually in the course file folder if you want a copy of this list. And it's planning, attire, and by attire I mean basically the clothes that people are going to wear, but it's probably a little bit broader than that. Guests, venue, catering, flowers, memories, details, wedding day, and honeymoon. So they're going to be my main headings. And the first thing I'm going to do is to start adding each of those into my project plan. So let's take this first one, planning, and set that one up first. So I've created a new blank project, and in the task name, I'm going to enter planning. Now, a couple of things to point out here. I'm using Gantt chart view, and I did show you briefly earlier on in the course a couple of ways of switching to Gantt chart view if you've got no Gantt chart view on already. One way is to use the buttons down towards the right-hand end of the status bar, but you can also go into the View tab and select Gantt chart view there. Another thing to bear in mind is that you should have new tasks set to auto scheduled, or what I'm going to do next won't work for you. So having entered planning as the task name, I press the tab key, and a number of fields are filled in for my first task, and one of them is duration. And by default, a task has a duration of 1 day with a question mark normally. Now, what the question mark means is that this is an estimated duration. And what one normally does is to leave the duration as an estimate until you have actually got a reasonably reliable duration for that task. Now, at this stage, I'm not going to worry about duration at all. I'm just going to get all of those tasks in the list. But bear in mind, those question marks are a good way of reminding myself that that's just an estimate of the duration. And believe me, when planning a wedding, it's a lot longer than a 1-day task. Let's ignore the work column for a moment and let's take a look at start. And you can just about see the start date is Tuesday, March the 5th, 2019. Now, one thing that may or may not be annoying you already is being able to see the contents of all of these fields. So let's deal with that first. If you need to make these columns wider or narrower, if you hover over the edge, and you'll see the cursor change to a double-headed arrow. If you click the mouse at that point and drag one way or the other, you can make the columns wider or narrower depending on your personal preference. We're going to do a little bit more work on how to format Gantt charts, how to lay them out more neatly later on, but for the moment that's probably one of the most important things you need to be able to do, just resizing those columns. And also there is a bar, a vertical dividing line between the table on the left and the chart on the right. And if you hover over that vertical bar in any way, you get a slightly different double-headed arrow. And you can change the divider so that you can see more or less of the table or more or less of the chart. So again, that's entirely up to you and how you like to work. Now let's go back to this start date, Tuesday, March the 5th, 2019. Now by default, new tasks are either created on the project start date or on the current date. Now in this case, both the start and finish date are the same. They're today's date. And you can check which it's set to by looking at project options on the schedule page. I do suggest you have a quick look at that now. So what is the project start date? By default, the project start date is the date I created the project. And I created this project today, so that's why we have a start date of today. If you click on the Project tab on the ribbon, and in the Properties group, normally the first button there is Project Information. So let's click on that. And one of the basic pieces of information we have in there is the start date for the project, which is showing here currently highlighted. It will also tell you in this case what the finish date is as well. Now, of course, I haven't really got much work scheduled on this project at the moment, so it means that I can start planning this wedding today, and I can actually have the wedding today as well because I will be ready. I'm just going to go back to what I was saying now about project options. You can see here that we're scheduling from project start date. Some projects might be scheduled from the project finish date. Now, it's very conventional to start a project and say to yourself, when will I be ready? But also what often happens is that you know when you've got to be finished by, and what you really need to know is when you should start the project. You can do both of those types of scheduling in Project 2019, but it's very important to know at any time whether you're scheduling from the start date or to the finish date. The approach we're taking now with planning this wedding is that we're starting at a start date, and when we've done all the planning and got all the other activities in, we'll know when we can be ready by. So we haven't got a date for the wedding yet. We need to do a lot of work to do a lot of planning first, but we will find out when we would be ready to have the wedding by. So let me cancel this dialogue for now. And I'm going to put in a couple more of the tasks into my project. Okay, so I've got those 3 tasks in there now. You might be slightly surprised by how my plan looks, but there are very good reasons for it. At the moment, I've not told Project 2019 much about these tasks at all. I haven't, for instance, said that attire must happen after planning or that guests must happen after attire. So it has no reason to put these tasks in any kind of sequence. A very important point as well here is that you don't actually have to enter the tasks of a project in chronological sequence. I could put all of these in any order that I wanted to. But the convention is that the tasks you expect to at least start first go first in the list. Now in the left-hand column here, you have something called a task ID. And as you'll see later on in the course, task IDs fulfill a very important purpose. But one way of looking at this is that generally speaking, the convention is that the task with the lower IDs correspond to the tasks that are performed earliest in the project. Having said that, as you'll see later on with this wedding plan, the individual elements that make up each of these tasks, and bear in mind we're going to break each of these tasks down as we go through, will overlap some of the things that we thought were going to be earlier on or will be later on and so on. And in any case, as the project progresses, things will tend to change. So having the earliest tasks as the ones with the lowest ID numbers is more of a sort of general guideline than any sort of specific rule. The next thing I'm going to do is put in the rest of those tasks. And there we are. I have all those headings in. All of them have an estimated duration of 1 day, which is clearly not the case, but we have a starting point for our plan. And having done that work, the next most important thing to do is save that plan. And that's what we're going to do first in the next section. So I will see you then. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section, we're going to look at some other basic properties of tasks, and I'm just going to go back to that first version of the wedding plan that we were looking at. So the top one here, remember I've got it pinned to the top of the list, makes it super easy to access, and I'm just going to open that by double clicking. Now if I look at that first task, the one with the name planning, and if I click in the duration field, the duration, as I explained earlier, has a default value of 1 day, which you can see here, with a little question mark next to it, which indicated that this is an estimated duration. I can, of course, use these little scroll bars at the side, these little scroll arrows, to increase the duration, or alternatively decrease the duration. And you'll see as soon as I do that, the question mark is removed, so it's no longer an estimated duration because I'm inputting something into that duration cell. Now I don't have to use these little scroll arrows just here. For instance, if I went into the attire field, for example, I can literally click in this field and I can type something in there if I wanted to. So I could type 3 days, for example. And you'll see that as I type that, if you look up into the little bar at the top here, it also inputs 3 days. And if I'm happy with that, I can click on the tick to accept it like so. And as you can see, as I adapt and adjust the duration of these tasks, the bar in the Gantt chart on the right extends accordingly. So we now have these 2 bars showing as 3 days and the rest of my plan showing as 1 day. Now we haven't actually looked at the definition of working days and working weeks and working hours as yet, but you can probably see from that when I'm talking about, for example, an 8-day task, I'm talking about 8 working days, and that doesn't include days at the weekend with the current calendar that I'm using on this project. Now look very carefully at the bar chart on the right, because for the tasks that still have a 1 day estimated duration, you'll see that at the right hand end of each of those, you've got a vertical line, this one just here. Now it's pretty much coincidence that it's at the right hand end of those bars. That vertical line indicates the current date. So that is essentially what I like to call the today line. So at any point you can see where you are today in relation to the project, or if you like, where the project is in relation to today. And we've talked about the project's start date. Supposing I was entering this project and in fact the various aspects of it had started a couple of weeks ago, I'm a bit late setting this project up in Project 2019. So some of these things may have already happened. What I could do is change the project start date. So look, for example, at that first planning task, which says it starts on March the 14th. So that's the date that I entered it yesterday, and that is currently the start date for this project. So let's go into project information, which you'll find up here on the project ribbon and down into project information. So let's go in and change this start date to a date 2 weeks ago. And you see I have my little calendar here. So I'm going to select Friday the 1st of March and then click on OK. Now none of the durations have changed, but each of the tasks has an updated start date. Now, of course, I could change the individual task start dates. So for instance, if I wanted to change the date that the attire task is starting, and if I decide that attire is something we maybe need to think about a little bit, and I know that people need to sort out their clothes, but I think I'm going to leave that until after the Easter break. So I might want to change this attire start date to after Easter. So I'm going to put it a month in advance. So let's say April let's do 15th. So that's when the task is going to start. Now in doing that, one of the problems I have is that this task is now shut off to the right in my chart. If you look, I can no longer see it. That may or may not be a problem, But you know how to resolve that already because you know about the zoom slider. So right in the bottom corner, we have our little zoom slider with our plus and our minus buttons to control it. And the only reason I can't see it is because we're not on that correct part of the Gantt chart. So if you look at the dates running across the top, they don't go as far enough into the future currently for me to be able to see the start date of this task. So I'm going to zoom out very slightly by clicking on the minus. And there we go. You can see my little task pop into view as I zoom out a couple of times. And of course, if I wanted to, I could not only set the duration of each of these tasks, but I could start to actually set them out in time. So for instance, I could decide on a wedding day, and assuming that I'm confident we'd be ready for that, I could plot that at some time next year as well. And similarly, for each of those other tasks, I could set up a duration. I could decide on a start date, and I could start to put my project plan together with a lot more care and attention, and hopefully with a lot more resemblance to what is actually going to happen. And that is indeed what we're going to be doing over the next few sections. However, this project, if it's just comprised of those roughly 10 tasks, it wouldn't really be a very realistic project. So what we're going to need to do is put in a lot more detail to make this into a realistic planning exercise. Now, in order to do that, you need to know quite a lot more about tasks, and you need to know about things like dependencies and resources. And one of the things I'm going to tell you about, and in fact we're going to start on this straight away in the next section, is that you need to have an understanding of summary tasks and outlining. But for the balance of this section, I just want to look at information about tasks. Now we've seen task name, duration, start and finish date. I mentioned work once or twice. Now, before I do this, if I look across at my column headings where I have task name, duration, start, finish, so on and so forth, and if I drag this across very slightly, you can see that I don't have a column currently labeled work, and I want to have a column called work. So if you do need to make adjustments to what columns you see here, if you look right at the end, we have something that says add new column. So I'm going to click the drop down. And there is a whole host of different columns that you can select, and they are in alphabetical order, making it slightly easier for you to find the one you want. And I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and I'm going to look for the one that says work, and there it is. So let's select it, and you see I now have a work column. So I'm just going to grab it and drag all the way across, and I'm going to drop it next to task name. And now you see I have my new column in between task name and duration. Let's get back to just talking about information about tasks. For any task in Project 2019, there is an awful lot of information about that task available, and you may need to be able to manipulate that in some way. Now I've got the attire task selected, and what I'm going to do is right click on that row to bring up the contextual menu. And one of the options, about fourth from the bottom there, is information. And I'm going to click information, and it brings up the task information dialog. Now this is a dialog with half a dozen or so tabs running across the top, and each tab has information about the selected task. Much of the information won't mean much at the moment, but by the end of the course, most of it will, hopefully. And some things, I think the descriptions that you can see here, pretty much explain what that particular piece of task information is about. So for instance, you know about the name, but what about percentage complete, or the amount of work that we've done? Well, currently we haven't done any of it, so that's why it's showing as 0% complete. It's an auto-scheduled task. We've briefly mentioned that previously. And you can see the start date and the finish date there. It's not an estimated duration, so that's why this checkbox isn't ticked. And it's a 3-day task. and it has a priority of 500. Now, the other properties on this particular tab are ones that we're going to be looking at later on. But let's look at the other tab. So let's jump across and take a look at predecessors. What are this task's predecessors? Which tasks must happen before this one? Or which tasks in some way depend on this one? Which resources does it use? And there is also an advanced tab with information like deadlines, constraints, specific calendars to use, and so on. Virtually all of these we're going to be looking at during this course. We can also do things like record notes about the task, and we can even set up custom fields with custom information about the task. So that's the task information for that particular attire task. Let me cancel out of this and just point out something I've mentioned a couple of times before. Task information is a good example of something which you can get at in a variety of different ways. So with the same attire task selected, if I go to the Task tab at the top, and on the ribbon there is a button in the Properties group called Information. And that brings up the exact same dialog box. Let's cancel out of there. Another way I can bring that up is to just double click on the attire task. And you see I get exactly the same dialog box. So a few different ways for you to bring up that task information box. And that is something important for you to remember, because being able to access this task information box quickly is something that's going to be pretty important to you as you run through this course. And if you want to do a little bit of extra reading about task information, remember that you do always have that help button down in the bottom left-hand corner of the task information box. So that's it for this section. I will see you in the next one.